King Durin. Prince, farewell.
The series of events in Amazon's Rings of Power have been shaping up, bizarrely, to say the least. We've already seen Durin III plagued by the ring-induced greed akin to dragon sickness. This felt like quite an exaggeration of what Tolkien originally wrote about. In this marvelous video, we're not only going to talk about the effects of the Dwarven Rings of Power, but also take a closer look at their bearers. The Dwarves were one of Tolkien's races that stood out in stark contrast, due to their unique physiology and creation. So put your mining hats on as we delve beneath the earth and explore the deep worlds of the dwarves. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Who were the dwarves in Tolkien's lore? We've often spoken about how Ea was conceived. Ea was the created world spoken into being by the supreme creator Eru Ilúvatar. The creator's vision for the world was actualized through the music of the Ainur, also known as the Ainulindale. We also know that the Shadow was born through Morgoth's discourse and the beautifully woven harmonies of the Ainur. The Ainur spirits of the Valar descended onto Arda in order to shape the world into being. As the queen of the Valar, Varda kindled the stars into existence. The elves awoke by Lake Cuiviénen soon after. The elves were known as Eru Ilúvatar's firstborn children. The race of men was the secondborn, with the elves as their elder brethren. Now, it was said that one of the Vala, Aule, grew increasingly impatient with the impending arrival of the children of Ilúvatar. He attempted to do the seemingly impossible, create a sentient life of his own during the sleep of Yavanna. This was a dark period of stillness in the most ancient years of Arda, when creatures from the Utumno freely roamed the lands. So Aule went the extra mile to create the seven fathers of the dwarves, who were supernaturally stronger and more resilient than any other race. But only Ilúvatar possessed the flame imperishable, the power of his creation that bestowed sentience into his chosen living beings. Hence, the first seven fathers of the dwarves remained silent and still, unable to move at all when their creator Aule wasn't with them. Once Eru Ilúvatar realized the Vala's actions, he proceeded to reprimand Aule for what he had created. In his act of repentance, the creator of the dwarves was more than willing to destroy his creations. The first ever dwarves cowered before Ilúvatar, begging the supreme deity for mercy on their lives. Ilúvatar settled on sparing Aule's creations and considered them his adopted children instead. But the seven fathers of all dwarves weren't set free yet, as they had to wait for the elves to awaken first. So Ilúvatar sent them into a deep slumber. The first ancestor of Durin was put to sleep in Mount Gundabad. He later awoke, wandered along the valleys of the Misty Mountains, and named one of them as Anulbazar. He would go on to found the kingdom of Khazad-dûm too. But more on all seven clans of the dwarves later in the video.
You have to wear a ring, my son.
The appearance and characteristics of Tolkien's dwarves. As their name suggests, dwarves were people of shorter stature who stood around 4 to 5 feet high. They were slightly taller than the average hobbit, but much more sturdily built. For you see, at the time of their creation, Aule had not yet set his eyes on the true children of Ilúvatar. He created them to be inherently strong in mind, body, and soul, as the lands of ancient Arda were infested with creatures from Utumno. Yet their most defining characteristic is related to their majestic beards, which began growing pretty much right after birth. Both male and female dwarves possessed impressive long beards, which were never to be touched. Even the thought of shaving was sacrilege. Remember the unique ways the dwarves were described in The Hobbit? Dwalin, for instance, had a bright blue beard, tucked neatly into a shiny gold belt. Dwarves chose to either wear their beards in their full glory or braid them for tidiness. It was said that female dwarves looked identical, if not fiercer, than their male counterparts, although the population of female dwarves was comparatively smaller. As an ode to the nature of their own creator, the dwarves were naturally hardy. They were highly resilient to extreme environments, whether that be the deepest mines or snow-ridden peaks of their valleys. Again, we'll talk more about just how tough Tolkien's dwarves are in a minute. The clans of dwarves were also blessed with longevity. The average lifespan had to be around 250 years, yet it was also believed that Durin I was nearly 2,500 years old. Did you know that the race of dwarves strongly believed in reincarnation? As in, the spirit of Durin I returned continually in each new generation. They also believed in the strong presence of their ancestors' spirits in times of hardship. When it came to their intense personalities, you wouldn't find anyone more loyal than a dwarf, but that also meant they took betrayals very personally. Given their lifespans, you could say that no one holds a longer-lasting grudge than Tolkien's dwarves. They were highly protective of their craft and fiercely guarded its secrets. It was believed that the dwarves were greedy by nature, and this was only enhanced by the rings of power that they soon received. Their gold lust often landed them in hot water, such as the dispute over Nauglamir, aka the Necklace of the Dwarves, which led to the killing of the Teleri king Eleuthingol. This was the spark that ignited the infamous rivalry between the races of dwarves and elves.
Okay, lads! Roll my bastard!
What are the 7 clans of the dwarves? Most notably, we have Durin's folk, aka the Longbeards, who were founded by Durin I. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to find our long forgotten gold. The Longbeards originated from Mount Gundabad and went on to discover the kingdom of Khazad-dûm. Durin's folk were scattered throughout the land, across the Iron Hills, Grey Mountains, and even Dunland. Thorin's realm was in the Blue Mountains, and under the Lonely Mountain, Erebor. Then, of course, we have the Glittering Caves, nestled in the White Mountains. The following 2 clans of dwarves were the Firebeards and Broadbeams, who founded the kingdoms of Nogrod and Belagost. In the First Age, the War of the Wrath, their homelands were wrecked beyond measure, which prompted them to come and live with the Longbeards. Then we have the clans of Iron Fists and Stiffbeards, who mainly resided in the far east of Rune. Finally, the clans of Blacklocks and Stonefoots also awakened in the Red Mountains, named Orokarni. The last 4 clans of dwarves were forced to flee their homes as the east was overcome by the Shadow in the Third Age. History of the dwarves in Tolkien's lore. So, once the first elves had finally awakened under the stars by the shores of Cuiviénen, the dwarves were woken up as well. The eldest of all 7 fathers of the dwarves was Durin I, who was famously known as Durin the Deathless. As we mentioned earlier, Durin I wandered along the Misty Mountains until he founded the kingdom of Khazad-dûm, nestled under the peaks of Ziraxagil, Barazinbar, and Bundushathur. Under the Deathless rule, the Longbeard dwarves led plentiful lives, prospering in their kingdom rich with treasure. If we move westward from Khazad-dûm, here lay the cities of Belagost and Nogrod, founded in the Blue Mountains. The dwarves of Belagost invented chainmail even before the elves arrived in Beleriand. Among countless of their memorable feats, they constructed the city of Menegroth in the kingdom of Doriath. Perhaps the most remarkable feat of the Nogrod dwarves was by the hands of the Telkar of the Blue Mountains. The smith forged the legendary blades Narsil and Angrist. Later, these blades would be wielded by King Elendil and Beren, respectively. Finally, Telkar also forged the Dorlumine, or Dragon Helm, shortly after the Wars of Beleriand for the Lord of Belagost, Azaghal. The helmet was far too bulky to be worn by any elf. In all ways, it was meant only for the dwarves. Praises must be sung for the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, who fearlessly fought against the tyranny of Morgoth during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, which was one of many battles that took place in the Wars of Beleriand. The brave dwarven lord of Belagost, Azaghal, was the one who stabbed the great Glaurung. As many of you might know, Glaurung was the first ever dragon to come into being, so confronting such a terrible enemy head-on was a true statement of Azaghal's bravery. Following the whole debacle of Thingol's slaying over the Nauglamir, the army of Nogrod dwarves was wiped out by the Green Elves and the Ents. The cataclysmic War of the Wrath nearly broke all of Beleriand. Along with Nogrod and Belagost, the refugees fled these destroyed kingdoms and eventually settled down in Khazad-dûm. Meanwhile, the Longbeards of Khazad-dûm remained as prosperous as they always were, colonizing the uncharted lands of the Grey Mountains and the Iron Hills. At the dawn of the Second Age, the Firebeards and Broadbeams of the Blue Mountains also left their ruined homes in search of the glorious kingdom of Khazad-dûm. The kingdom of Eregion was also established in the Second Age. Despite their past grievances, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the jewel smiths of Eregion liberally traded with one another. This alliance led to the building of the Doors of Durin by the master smith Celebrimbor and the great dwarven craftsman Narvi. The Doors of Durin, which were also the west gate of Moria, symbolized the cooperation between the two races. The resources and raw materials from the dwarven kingdom greatly aided the Gwaith'i Myrdain, while their skills and expertise came in handy for the Khazad dwarves. Sadly, this friendship was short-lived, as the Dark Lord Sauron's eyes soon turned on the Elven Kingdom. In his fair elven form, Anatar gave each of the 7 dwarven lords a ring of power. Surprisingly, the rings failed to work their seduction on the hearts of the dwarves like they had on men. Again, a testimony of Aule's iron-strong will that he had imbued into his creations. They were immune to the false promises of glory whispered by the rings. Unlike what they've depicted in the show, Durin third is overcome with a dragon sickness-like greed. But back to the alliance between the Noldor elves of Eregion and Dwarves of Moria. Eregion never stood a chance when Sauron launched a full-blown siege on the kingdom. The dwarves came to the elves' rescue by attacking Sauron's forces from unexpected directions, but it was all in vain. Once Eregion fell, the doors of Durin that once stood open and welcoming were sealed shut to protect the west end of Moria from assailing orcs. As the Second Age drew to an end, hardly any dwarves played an active role in the War of the Last Alliance. Some traitorous ones even joined up with Sauron. But again, the finest of the bunch, the Khazad-dûm dwarves, fought fiercely alongside the alliance of men and elves. Now, the Third Age was the most eventful for the dwarves. Hint hint, Azog's pale head on a spike. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Sauron's return presence was a plague that spread across the seemingly peaceful lands of Middle-earth. This resulted in the Misty Mountains being overrun by creatures of the Shadow, attempting to push the dwarves out of their homes. In the year 1980 of the Third Age, the dwarves inevitably got too greedy. In the pursuit of Mithril, they recklessly dug too deep. This was bound to awaken an ancient beast who was better left slumbering. The Balrog, who had fled the War of Wrath, had been disturbed out of its hibernation. Consequently, it chased the mining dwarves out of Khazad-dûm altogether, which then came to be known as Moria. It also killed Durin IV, which garnered it the infamous moniker Durin's Bane. One of Durin's folk, Thrain I, founded the kingdom of Erebor, the kingdom under the mountain, where they lived in bountiful peace until the year 2770 of the Third Age, until the increasing threat of the northern dragons jarred the dwarves into action once again. It seemed like the fate of dwarves forced them to flee from one place to another for many ages to come. But King Thror decided to reclaim the dwarves' once glorious kingdom, Khazad-dûm. By the gates of Moria, Azog the Defiler beheaded the king, carved his ruinous name on the head, and tossed a measly coin purse to the messenger. Nain, their king's brutalization, along with the pointed mockery of their wealth, fueled the flames of vengeance across all houses of the dwarves. Thror's son, Thrain II, began the monumental war between dwarves and orcs. The forces of the dwarves relentlessly tore through armies of goblins, orcs, and wargs. In the tremendous climactic battle of Azanulbizar, reinforcements in the form of the Iron Hill dwarves ensured their victory. The enemy was defeated, and Azog the Pale Orc was beheaded and mocked as he had deserved. The coin purse which was tossed at Nain was stuffed into his mouth. The Pale Orc remained a menace no more. Even after this, the dwarves were unable to reclaim Moria, as Durin's Bane, the Balrog, still lurked inside. Thrain's son, Thorin II, rounded up a company of the 12 finest dwarves to reclaim the kingdom under the mountain. This was the quest for Erebor. One of the more endearing stories of Tolkien involved a strange hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, as their burglar. The saga ended with the Battle of the Five Armies, which saw Thorin killed by Azog, yet Erebor was reclaimed and made of the dwarves. We can't forget our favorite dwarf, Gimli, son of Gloin. As a part of the Fellowship of the Ring, he fought alongside his dear friend Legolas in the War of the Ring. The Fourth Age finally returned the dwarves well-deserved peace. Gimli went on to become the Lord of the Glittering Caves, while the dwarves of Erebor walked into the sunlight and helped the race of men rebuild their kingdoms, which had been destroyed by Sauron. In the year 120 of the Fourth Age, Gimli accompanied his friend Legolas onto a ship that sailed into Valinor. Keep in mind that he was the only dwarf who was led into the Undying Lands. Meanwhile, Durin the Seventh and the Last rebuilt Khazad-dûm to its former glory, where the Longbeards prospered once again until the end of their days. Were the dwarves really disliked in Tolkien's lore? Well, disliked by some elves, but not all, and never forever. As we mentioned earlier, the first spat between the elves and dwarves was born from the slaying of the Teleri king Thingol. The king had wished to take the necklace of Nauglamir and embed it with one of the Silmarils, so he hired the greatest dwarven artisans to work on creating the greatest symbol of the alliance between the elves and the dwarves. However, the dwarves were far from happy with this, and they desired to reclaim a piece of their ancestral jewelry. One thing led to another. The king suspected the dwarves actually wanted the Silmaril for themselves. Insults were hurled back and forth until the dwarves launched themselves on Thingol and killed him. This was followed by the destruction of Menegroth and the kingdom of Doriath altogether. While some elves, like Thranduil, remained distrustful of the dwarves for ages to come, the elves of Eregion were an exception. Even the dwarves of Belegost were friendly with the Noldor elves. The Ents, on the other hand, were created to protect Yavanna's creations from the axe of the dwarves. Yavanna was the wife of Aule, the Vala, who was mainly concerned with rock and metal craftsmanship. Yavanna feared that her husband's creations, the dwarves, would limitlessly chop trees until the lands were stripped bare. Iluvatar sent the Ents as protective spirits, who grew a close bond with the first elves. Ents disliked the dwarves for all the trees they cut. The Dwarven Rings of Power. Did the rings magically enhance their wealth, or merely amplify their greed, leading to greater riches? By the year 1500 of the Second Age, the jewel-smiths of Eregion were deceived by Anatar, aka Sauron, into making 19 Rings of Power, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. Originally, Sauron as Anatar only gifted 6 to 6 dwarven kings, but to honor dwarven tradition, Master Smith Lord Celebrimbor gifted 1 more to Durin III. The 7th ring was the most renowned, known as the Ring of Thror. The one with a great blue jewel was passed down from one King Durin to the next. Now, it was said that the dwarven lords used the Rings of Power to amplify their treasure greatly. As Tolkien stated, the Rings of Power enhance the wearer's innate abilities and desires. This means that the dwarven Rings of Power enhance the dwarves' natural skill into delve mastery and desire to accumulate more wealth than ever. Soon, the 7 hordes of the 7 dwarven kings came into being. These were legendary mounds of treasure collected by the dwarven lords across their realms. But remember that this treasure was found thanks to their Rings of Power. Although the rings successfully worked to boost the greed of the dwarves in a way that contributed to Sauron's longer-term scheme, the dwarves remained entirely uncorrupted by the ring's seduction. In the Silmarillion, it was made clear that the dwarves were genuinely resistant to not only Morgoth's influence, but also Sauron's attempt to capture their free wills. The inherent hardiness of the dwarves saved them from being willing slaves of the One Ring, once it was forged. Could you imagine a dwarven king as one of the ring wraiths? The very thought seems laughable. It was believed that the more powerful a dwarven lord was, the higher his resilience to Sauron's temptations. That being said, the dwarves didn't get off entirely scot-free. Let's look at King Thror, for instance. His love for jewels and gold grew obsessive, which inevitably attracted the worst kind of attention. Remember the 7 hordes? In the Third Age, 4 of these piles of treasures were greedily devoured by the dragons of the north, one of them being Smaug the Tyrannical. The fire drake from the north laid waste across the realm of Dale and took Erebor and all its treasure by force. How tough are the dwarves in Tolkien's lore? To put it simply, the dwarves were a race created to be tough. Toughness was in their blood. Just take a look at their creator, Aule the Great Smith, who specialized in craftsmanship from the lands and mountains to the deep basins of the ocean. He was the 3rd most powerful Eretar, who wished to imbue his knowledge and skill in his creations. As hardy as him, he made them the most redoubtable warriors of all the speaking peoples. The dwarves were nearly indestructible in mind, body, and soul. Their livelihoods demanded strenuous physical labor on the daily. As miners, they equipped themselves with pickaxes, hammers, bellows, and anvils, spending day after day deep in the veins of ore. Dwarves were sturdily built and were able to wear chainmail for long hours. Case in point, Dane Ironfoot and his armies marched from the Iron Hills to Erebor impressively fast. In the Two Towers, Gimli, decked out in heavy dwarven armor and accompanied by Legolas and Aragorn, to track the Uruk-hai over the course of 3 days with barely any rest. We've already seen their iron wills, with their incredible resistance to the destructive magic of the Rings of Power. One might even argue that the dwarves were high up on the tier of Tolkien's strongest races.
I have nothing to prove to you, boy.
Tolkien's dwarves versus traditional folklore dwarves. What sets Tolkien's dwarves apart? In Norse, Celtic, and Germanic legends, dwarves were described as supernatural beings who were also considered to be fairies. Some dwarves from folklore had long white beards and humpbacks. Akin to Tolkien's dwarves, Nordic ones also inhabited the crevices of mountains and organized mine shafts. So in more ways than one, Tolkien's concept of dwarves aligns with the traditional idea of ancient myth. Dwarves of folklore were divided into clans, tribes, and armies, each with its own kings, chieftains, and lords. They were also closely associated with excellent craftsmanship, being skilled handlers of metal and precious jewels. Countless dwarven folk tales, myths, and fairy tales have existed for long, but none of them brought them into prominence the way Tolkien did. Tolkien's dwarves were a force of nature by themselves, created without the touch of the supreme deity of his universe. Tolkien's dwarves could be considered the most exceptional of the traditional Nordic dwarf archetype. One defining characteristic that set Tolkien's dwarves apart was the fact that they engaged in all of our battles and wars. Traditional dwarves weren't described as fighters by any means. In fact, all their treasures would be stolen from them through forceful means. So you could say that Nordic, Celtic, and Germanic legends of dwarves set the foundation for one of Tolkien's most beloved races. Are dwarves immortal? What is a dwarven lifespan? Although the dwarves had a longer lifespan compared to the race of men, they weren't immortal by any means. Actually, it even depended on the clan of the dwarves. For instance, the Longbeards or Durin's folk were the ones who lived the longest. However, their longevity was significantly reduced by the Third Age. So after this point in time, the average lifespan of a Longbeard dwarf hovered around 200 and 150 years. But the lineage of Durin the Kings was strangely longer lived. More exceptions included the dwarf named Dwalin, who lived out to an impressive impressive 340 years of age. Dwarves who were nearing 30 were still considered relatively young and fragile for war and craftsmanship. By the time they turned 40, the dwarf would solidify their identity and appearance wholly. This fact made Dane's slaying of Azog the Defiler even more impressive, as he was merely 32 at the time of vengeance. The dwarves never really visibly aged, only gaining a wrinkle or two when their lives approached near death. We must also remember that the dwarven rings of power never worked their magic on their bearers, which meant that the rings never extended the dwarven king's lifespans by any means. How do dwarves perpetuate their kind? Well, the dwarves reproduce like all humans do, for which an explanation isn't really required. Anyway, the dwarves were primarily concerned with their own craftsmanship, which resulted in an extremely slow increase in their numbers. This was mainly due to the need for more dwarf women, who added up to only 1/3 of the whole dwarven population. Dwarf women were picky with whom they would marry, and rarely did so before the age of 90. Even so, not all dwarf women engaged in marriage, or any sexual relations at all. This meant that, even out of the minuscule number, not all dwarf women chose to have children. Even when they did get married, a dwarven household would have no more than 4 children. On the other hand, dwarf men seemed hardly interested in marriage or domestic bliss, being consumed with work in the mines. All this added up to a negative population growth or a decline in the birth rate for the dwarves, and the inching increase in population didn't make up for the number of deaths. But we also mustn't mistake this for a general disinterest in family and community. Dwarf women were fiercely loyal partners and dedicated mothers, who ensured their offspring would grow up to be the best of the best. Dwarven craftsmanship. Blessed by their creator, Aule, the great smith of the Valar, dwarves were made to be the finest miners in all of Middle-earth. As we've seen, the dwarves mostly lived under the surface of the earth, in great halls, carved right into the base of mountains. Their livelihood and sustenance were made up by the discovery and mining of precious ores, metals, and gems. However, Tolkien never specified when the finding of Mithril would be revolutionary. It was first found in the lodes that led north from the kingdom of Moria to the peak of the Caradhras. Mithril also significantly boosted the trading alliance between the Khazad dwarves and Noldor elves of Eregion for their special elven crafts. Apart from this, the dwarves were exceptional iron, black, and goldsmiths, with a special touch in masonry. Any jewel, no matter how common or precious, could be fashioned into an object of marvel. Weapon and armor of Tolkien dwarves. Now, we've all seen the live-action interpretations of Tolkien's dwarves in their hefty yet fashionable armor. Their armor matched their sturdiness, as it never wore them down. In the 17th chapter of The Hobbit, they were described as clad in a hauberk of steel mail that hung to his knees, and his legs were covered with a hose of a fine and flexible metal mesh. In battle, they wielded heavy two-handed mattocks, but each of them had also a short broadsword at his side and a round shield slung at his back. Their beards were forked and plated, and thrust into their belts. Their caps were of iron, and they were shod with iron, and their faces were grim. Come on, if that doesn't intimidate their enemy, then what would? Their ideal weapons were multi-purpose, which posed as a weapon and tool in one. These ranged from short broadswords, heavy warhammers, hatchets, and most famously, razor-sharp battle axes. Do you know which piece of dwarven armor was worth more than the entire Shire combined? Their chainmail armor was made from Mithril. This was a precious set that was gifted to Bilbo Baggins and passed down to Frodo Baggins, which in turn saved his life on countless occasions. Language and writing of the dwarves. Their language of Kuzdul, or Dwarvish, was also conceptualized by the Vala Aule. It was a tightly guarded culture that strictly allowed dwarves to learn and speak. However, when the dwarves first encountered the elves in Beleriand in the First Age, they could only communicate with one another in Sindarin. The dwarves grew increasingly inspired by the Elvish runes, which made up the written language of Sindarin, and eventually came up with their own. This was named Angarthas, which was then adopted uniquely by each dwarven clan. The Book of Mazarbul saw the mode of Angarthas picked up by the dwarves of Erebor. Dwarves and other versions of the legendarium. Believe it or not, dwarves weren't always the fierce yet benevolent warriors that we know them as. Like in the Book of Lost Tales, the wicked dwarves were downright evil, who sided with the Dark Lord Melkor in his conquest against the light. In earlier versions of Tolkien's legendarium, the dwarves only respected their creator Aule's existence, and not Ilúvatar's. Also, in The Hobbit, dwarves are lightheartedly described as a lot more comical, with colorful beards and bumbling dialogues, unlike the stoic, driven characters like Gimli in the Lord of the Rings saga. Also, the dwarves' greed for their treasure of wealth could be interpreted simply as their sense of honor or duty to their kingdom and ancestors. Marvelous verdict. There you have it, folks. All about the wondrous worlds of Tolkien's dwarves. Say what you will about how graceful the elves were, the dwarves were the most badass. In a way, they embodied the substances of Earth, over which they had mastery. Unbreakable as the toughest rock, unique as every rare gem, and untarnished as the purest gold. Out of all the clans, kings, and dwarves we've spoken about, which one has been your favorite? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time.